Well, hello again. This is Todd with Cemetery Walks. Unfortunately, the first part of this video, the intro, and the first tier of graves that we looked at, I do not have any audio. So we're going to let that play out with a little background music, and we'll pick up the audio once it comes back in. Here we have Ralph Wallace Jenkins. Tech 5 U.S. Army, World War II, August 8th, 1917, June 7th, 1995. Thank you much for your service and sacrifice, sir. I forgot to turn my mic on. Hopefully you heard some of that. We have David H. Arp, Colonel, U.S. Army, World War II, Korea, November 19th, 1911 to May, looks like 7th, 1999. Thank you much for your service. And Ray Babcock, U.S. Air Force, February 22nd, 1930 to May 3rd, 1996. Thank you for your service, sir. We have Henry Grady Chastain Jr., U.S. Marine Corps, World War II. That would be November 1st, 1923 to July 4th, 1988. Thank you much for your service, sir. Johnny Claude Perkins, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, World War II, December 20th, 1920 to January 12th, 1978. Thank you much for your service, sir. Clyde A. Milton, Tex 5, U.S. Army, World War II, 1910 to 1978. Thank you much for your service, sir. A few others, Carl Aubrey Reynolds, Lieutenant, U.S. Navy, World War II, April 23rd, 1911, September 13th, 1990. Thank you much for your service, sir. Here we have David Jewel Logan, okay, Second Lieutenant, U.S. Army, August 2nd, 1931 to July 26, 1985. Maynard L. Field, Corporal, U.S. Army, World War II, January 21st, 1918 to July 3rd, 2002. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have John M. Garrett, Jr., U.S. Navy, August 8th, 1922 to May 22nd, 1987. Thank you much for your service, sir. Wilson C. Mosley, Tech Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, World War II, July 13th, 1915, August 12th, 1986. Thank you much for your service, sir. William G. Wingate, Private, U.S. Army, December 3rd, 1922 to August 30th, 1987. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have William Jackson Hall, U.S. Merchant Marine, World War II, July 10th, 1927 to June 24th, 1997. Thank you much for your service, sir. And we were just up there. There are a few right there, but I couldn't get to them from this side. I'll have to go back around. Robert L. Haddon, CMB, U.S. Navy, World War II, September 21st, 1919 to January 7th, 1992. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have Dan E. Westmoreland, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, World War II, May 25th, 1920 to August 10th, 2002, Purple Heart. Thank you much for your service and sacrifice, sir. This is Smith. It's way covered up. Hayden Smith Kell. Looks like Corporal, U.S. Army, World War II, 1911 to 1985.
Very.
Thank you much for your service, sir. We have Bill M. Nelson, Corporal, U.S. Army, May 19th, 1929 to November 11th, 1990. Thank you much for your service and sacrifice, sir. Paul Jackson Nelson, PFC, U.S. Army, June 5th, 1927, January 7th, 1990. Thank you very much for your service, sir. And that looks to be Grady James DeBoard,
Who is that?
Corporal, U.S. Army, World War II, June 11th, 1914 to June 15th, 1981. Oh, excuse me, 1982. Thank you much for your service, sir. Here we have Charles Harold DeBoard, A2C, U.S. Air Force, July 17th, 1937 to December 18th, 2015. Thank you much for your service, sir.
Hospital.
Here we have James Carpenter Jr., Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, World War II, August 23rd, 1921 to February 28th, 1987. Thank you much for your service, sir. Charles M. Stevens, Corporal, U.S. Army, Korea, January 21st, 1929 to October 10th, 2005, Purple Heart. Thank you much for your service and sacrifice, sir. B.C. Logan Jr., April 8th, 1914 to September 23rd, 1981. Grace Dell Wright Logan, April 16th, 1917 to January 4th, 2004. And Jack Benjamin Logan, June 5th, 1938 to March 5th, 2002. We have another baby. William Logan, 1936, son of Grace and B.C. Logan Jr., brothers Jack, Mac, Gus, and Ted. Just a baby.
I'm visiting you.
Well, thank you for visiting me. If you could let me know your first or last name, that would be great. I'd love to tell your story if I can. This is Grady L. Logan, PFC, U.S. Army, World War II, June 29th, 1921 to May 15th, 1999. Thank you very much for your service, sir. James Lowry Cantrell, A2C, U.S. Air Force, Korea, February 27th, 1931 to November 1st, 2013. Thank you much for your service, sir. And we have Arthur H. Henson, Private, U.S. Army, June 28th, 1910 to July 11th, 1974. Thank you very much for your service, sir. And that looks to be a new headstone. It is still nice and shiny and lacquered unless they came back, cleaned it up, and re-lacquered it. Here we have James Earl Todd, A1C, U.S. Air Force, Korea, December 6, 1930 to February 9th, 2018.
Why must you know?
And we have James Hoyt Williams, Corporal, U.S. Army, Korea, 1931 to 1979. Thank you much for your service, sir. All right. Merle Dewey Card, Georgia, PFC, 5th Engineer Battalion, 2nd Division, World War I. January 27th, 1917 to August 26th, 2002. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have James Henry Charles, October 14th, 1938, January 3rd, 1983, PFC U.S. Army. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have Hoyt H. Anderson, Corporal U.S. Army, World War II, December 4th, 1922 to August 25th, 2005. Thank you much for your service, sir. This would be G.C. Goolsby Jr., Georgia, Specialist 5, 22nd Ordnance Company, Korea. I'll look up his information and provide his birth and passing dates. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have David Earl Crook, 2nd Lieutenant, U.S. Army, Korea, July 30th, 1928 to February 23rd, 2002. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have Thelbert Wimpy, PFC, U.S. Army Air Forces, World War II, January 10th, 1921 to March 14th, 2006. Thank you much for your service, sir. Thurbert Nelson, U.S. Navy, World War II, June 23rd, 1926 to January 18th, 1989. Thank you much for your service, sir. Charles C. Poindexter, 1st Lieutenant, U.S. Army, World War II, October 11th, 1918 to July 8th, 1987. Thank you very much for your service, sir. We have Hollis B. Bradford, CBM, U.S. Navy, World War II, July 14th, 1908 to February 23rd, 1993. Thank you very much for your service, sir.
Do you want it?
Henry Clyde Allen, Georgia, PFC, U.S. Army, World War I, January 26, 1894 to December 12, 1972. Thank you much for your service, sir. Here we have Hayden Cecil Whitaker, A1C, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam,
You're back.
June 15th, 1944 to February, is that 18th? No, 28th, 2016. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have Howell Payne, Georgia, Private 101st Infantry Division, World War I. Looks like October 1894 to May 27th, 1946. Thank you much for your service, sir. Ridgeway Payne, Georgia, Master Sergeant, 132nd Base Unit, World War I, March 24th, 1919 to March 2nd, 1956. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have Cole Kirby. So J. Waldo Kirby, 1888 to 1920. We have the flag here and the wreath. I guess is 1888, World War I, maybe?
Following you.
Well, come on and keep me company.
Stop.
Here we have F.A. Reese Jr., U.S. Coast Guard, December 31st, 1920 to February 13th, 2001. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have more halls here. Thomas L. Penland, PFC, U.S. Army, World War II, March 6, 1924 to September 19th, 1992. Thank you much for your service, sir. And another Samuel O. Penland, U.S. Marine Corps, World War II, February 5th, 1914 to October 22nd, 1993. Thank you much for your service, sir. Here we have Joseph Whitaker Ray, U.S. Army Air Forces, Senior Master Sergeant Air Force, Korea and Vietnam, September 10th, 1928, February 28th, 2020. Thank you much for your service and sacrifice, sir.
Bless.
David C. Ralston, Senior Master Sergeant, U.S. Air Force, Korea, Vietnam, December 2nd, 1930 to May 3rd, 2012. We have William Ralph Johnson, Corporal, U.S. Army, World War II. That would be September 27th, 1925 to July 1st, 2007. And Thomas J. Johnson, Private, U.S. Army, Korea, February 15th, 1931 to May 6th, 2000. And here we have William A. Johnson, Georgia, Corporal, Company G, 37th Infantry, World War I. And we started way up there. We have James Ronald Womack, ABU, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam, May 28th, 1946 to June 22nd, 2019. Thank you much for your service, sir. James E. Payne, Florida, PFC, U.S. Army, World War II. And some stickers.
No.
I'll find his information and provide it. I'm not going to try to dig through that. Thank you much for your service, sir. We have more Logans here. Paralee W. Logan, 1893 to 1971. Julie Logan, 1890 to 1963. James F. Waters, Colonel, U.S. Army, World War II, June 16th, 1909 to November 9th, 1985. Thank you very much for your service, Colonel. Here we have Theodore R. Coley, Georgia, Private, U.S. Private Infantry, World War II, April 30th, 1923, June 6th, 1944. Thank you very much for your service and sacrifice, sir. Lionel L. Clark, Corporal, U.S. Army, Korea, October 12th, 1929 to July 25th, 2007. Thank you much for your service, sir. And here we have John L. Nelson, Georgia, Private, 393rd Infantry, 99th Infantry Division, World War II, September 11th, 1924 to March 17th, 1945. Thank you much for your service, sacrifice, sir.